Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Author Talks. It's good to see so many of you. Many of my regulars come back again, and I'm glad you could join us this evening. We've got a great program this evening, so I'm going to get to this right away. I wanted to first let you know that with 10crucialdays.org that you see over my shoulder here, we've just announced that we're going to be doing two bus tours, one in May and one in August. And then we're going to do 4 of the traversing the 10 Crucial Days bus tours in the fall this year. So we've got a lot of tours coming up, which I'm very pleased about. You hear my clock in the background that gets us going. I also wanted to let you know that I will be using the chat feature where I will be posting where you can purchase our authors' books, proceeds to benefit the Sons of the American Revolution Research Library. And I will post a link to our author's website so that you will be able to contact him directly. And as you all know, I love it when you all ask questions. I've got some questions of my own for him, but please use the chat feature to send your questions to me, and we will include as many as we can into the program. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Willard Sterne Randall. I've been a big fan of Willard's for many years. He'll tell us a little bit about a few of his books. After a successful 17-year career as a features writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer and Philadelphia Magazine, and a stringer for other news organizations, Willard pursued an advanced studies degree in history at Princeton University. As a journalist, he won numerous prizes. His biographies, including a dual biography of Benjamin Franklin and his son William, also of Benedict Arnold, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Ethan Allen. He's also written both biographies and ebooks with his wife, who is a biographer and an award-winning poet, Nancy Nara. Willard, you'll have to tell me if I pronounced that right.
You did.
His biographies have also won numerous prestigious awards. He's taught history at John Cabot University in Rome. I bet that was fun. And the University of Vermont and Champlain College, where he is a distinguished scholar in history and professor emeritus. He's a contributing editor to Military History Quarterly, and he lives, writes, teaches, and lectures, and likes to swim in Burlington, Vermont. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce you all now to Willard, if I can get these buttons pressed properly. Okay, so there we go. Welcome, Willard. It's great to see you.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So before we start talking about your new book, tell us a little bit about some of your earlier books. And I'm going to share my screen here for everybody so that everyone can see some of the earlier books and how you got into tell us about how you got into writing these biographies.
I really backed into it. I was a feature writer for the Philadelphia Evening and Sunday Bulletin, and covering from time to time the state legislatures in Harrisburg and Trenton. And I was one day boning up a little on early New Jersey history when I stumbled across the fact that William Franklin was the last royal governor, and that he indeed was the son of Benjamin Franklin, which was a fact I had not read anywhere and really was quite striking to me. And so the first thing I did was to write a proposal to an organization founded by Franklin, the American Philosophical Society. And there, a wonderful biographer named Catherine Drinker Bowen took a liking to the idea and sponsored me. So she really gave me my start, and the Philosophical Society gave me their usual large grant of $750. But that was the little dough I put into writing biography. At every chance I've had since I was a kid, when my father was a real devotee of the Revolution, as soon as he was through with the book, I grabbed it and read it. So I had read all of Kenneth Roberts before I finished high school. And I wanted to write the way Roberts did. And in a way, I owe him a lot because he was an investigative reporter for the Saturday Evening Post in Washington after World War I. And I saw a possibility of someone focusing on the Revolutionary War, but write differently. Now, Robert's style was to always have a Falstaff figure, a cap huff or somebody, and he fictionalized facts. He was a fantastic researcher. So with him in mind, I began to work on a book on Franklin, father and son. And so that was the beginning of it. At the same time, I was still a working journalist. So for the bicentennial, I co-authored a book called Founding City, which appeared as Sunday tabloids on the Revolution for a year. And then also I stumbled into new material while working on William Franklin. So I was able to write a little book about the proprietary house at Perth Amboy, where William Franklin was arrested. So all these pieces began to converge, and I thought, I have to do a major book on the father and son. So I did, and that led to, I guess the next stop was Benedict Arnold. Now, how that came about, I moved up here to teach and to live, here being Burlington, Vermont, and sitting on a bench in Battery Park overlooking the lake, wondering what had happened here. If you're from Philadelphia, you're sure the whole revolution, anything important was there. But what happened north of there was obscure. And I didn't even know about the Battle of Valcour Island. When I found out about that, just by digging, I got very, very interested in how you could have a Benedict Arnold one day stopping the British again and again and again, and then winding up turning his coat and joining them. So there was no question I had to write that book. And that's the way it's gone. After that book, my wife said, you can't go on writing about generals. You walk around here like one. You've got to find somebody else to write about it. I was fascinated by Jefferson as a writer. What a beautiful writer he was. I didn't know his story. I didn't know his life. So there's been some aspect of each of these people that's been like a hawk that I had to get in and find out about them. So the Loyalists, I spent quite a few years on the Loyalists when nobody was writing about the Loyalists. I wrote about Benedict Arnold when most of the books were published, just had him as the traitor and the spy. But I've always kept in mind a line from Shakespeare: the evil that men do lives on after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. So I want to know the good and the bad about these people to really bring them to life.
Well, and one of the reasons why I've been such a big fan of yours for so many years is that it's great to learn more about just the actions that we hear about in the history books. I mean, you really tell wonderful stories, and they're very, very readable. So I applaud you with that. So I encourage everybody to find Willard's earlier books. Again, I'll put that link up It's at historyauthortalks.com. You'll be able to find all of his most of his books available. If not, you can get them at your local library or buy them online. But tell us now, if you would, the feature of the evening, the founders' fortunes. This is your newest book, and I, having finished reading it, I highly recommend it. How did you? What was the spark that had you pick on the founders' fortune? How money shaped the birth of America?
Well, as I kept writing the other books, biographies, questions sort of came up that never got answered, either in my writing or in most of what I was reading. And they became pretty important to me, such as who paid for the revolution? How did we get the guns? How do we manage that? Why did the French help us? We'd just been at war with them a dozen years before. So these niggling questions that didn't fit neatly in the people I was writing about at the time wouldn't go away. And then when I went to graduate school at Princeton, after writing 5 books and being a journalist all those years, I was kind of amazed to find out that all the founding fathers were only in it for the money, according to the theory that was prevalent, which was Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitutional Convention, and biography was in the trash, basically, among academic historians. That was considered hero worship or hagiography, but I wanted to put the two together and look at a representative number of the founding fathers, what their fortunes were. If you go to the Declaration of Independence, the last thing in it is they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. But nobody was saying what their fortunes were. Their lives, that was pretty obvious. If they got caught and they could, and the British were prepared to take them to England, they would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. And some of the founding fathers had been through the old gate of London and seen the skulls on spikes with ravens nesting in them that had been the heads of Scottish lairds only a generation before. So they knew the risk. But the other thing was risk. What kind of risk? There's so little economic history written except for economists. It's not usually approachable. So looking at a series of the founding fathers, from Benjamin Franklin, everybody knows Benjamin Franklin's story, but do they? Where did he get his money? How much did he have? How much was at risk? How much did he lose? Do we know everything about how wealthy he was? And that's an example of how I worked through this. George Washington, we know so much about him. But this guy was, his mother was 3 times widowed. He didn't have the money for dancing lessons. I can't think of a worse fate in colonial Virginia. This man wrote letters of proposal to a number of women and never got any answers because he didn't have the right social graces or connections. So how is it he wound up with Mount Vernon? How did that happen? And did he lose anything in the revolution, or was it all glory and profit? Why was he so broke that he took the presidency of the United States? In his own words, he wrote to his family and said, unless this has happened, I would not be able to sustain the lifestyle and retirement that I have grown used to. So he became president of the United States in part because he needed the money. Why has that been left out? These are the questions of an old investigative reporter.
So we understand the effects of the British economy after the French and Indian War. What happened in America after the French and Indian War? How did war change the fortunes of American landholders and merchants and other drivers of the economy?
Well, it made them all want to cross the mountains and have a bigger chunk of the West, which began with the Alleghenies, as they could get and expected and thought was their due. for fighting the French. When the French surrendered in the Treaty of Paris, Americans assumed that, all right, we can go west now. It's safe. We won't have the French and the Indians to worry about. And in fact, most of the founding fathers, excuse me, at one time or another were dabbling in real estate speculation, and not small scale. Benjamin Franklin and his son and people around him wanted 20 million acres of land. It's called the Midwest. And they almost got it, except the revolution came along and the deal fell apart. George Washington wanted the Mississippi Valley, and he owned most of the Ohio Valley by the time of the revolution. But they all thought very grandly about the land. The problem throughout all of this, I discovered, was Americans were land rich, but cash poor. So they had great expectations, but they couldn't pay for the land, they couldn't sell the land, and they couldn't collect rent for a lot of it. So that's a big part of the story all the way through.
So we had Woody Holton from South Carolina here a few weeks ago, and Woody points to Britain's need to protect its colonies from the Indian lands and the American Indians from the colonists' expansionist proclivities. With the proclamation of line of 1763, that was the gold rush, as you were just explaining. How did this pan out through the 1760s and into the early 1770s?
Well, I'm sitting in a house on the proclamation line, so half of Vermont would have been out of bounds. For example, it was just a strip of coastal colonies, in some places only 80 miles deep. How it panned out was it was the number one irritant for many of the revolutionaries, that they had fought on the side of the British as British subjects for generations. And then everything had always been handed back to the French by politicians meeting in Paris. And so the fact that as soon as the fighting was over for the French and Indian War, the British said, no, you can't go there. That is off limits. We're going to protect the people you were fighting, the Native Americans. Oh, and by the way, we will be able to monopolize the fur trade, which is one of the incentives for the British, was to take that away from the French. That was the most valuable thing in North America, was fur.
So in your chapter, Tribune of the People, we learn so much more about Benjamin Franklin and his dabbling in political affairs. Explain the Pennsylvania Militia Act and the relationship between the Moravians and the Quakers and how that transformed Pennsylvania.
Well, we all think of Pennsylvania as the Quaker colony. The fact is that their percentage of the population was dwindling, and there were more and more Scots-Irish, many Rhineland Germans settling in places like Bethlehem, Allentown, the Lehigh Valley, and the Penns were doling out the land, selling the land, but they would not assume the expense of defense, and the questions were morally and philosophically opposed to it. So after Braddock's defeat on the Monongahela, Pennsylvania, for example, was wide open, and the French, well organized, with militia and Native Americans, were able to raid all the way to the outskirts of Philadelphia with nothing to stop them. Now Franklin had a lot to lose. He was already one of the wealthiest men in the colonies because he had figured out how to be a publisher and latch on to an evangelical preacher, George Whitefield, and publish all his books and sermons, and figure out how to take partners in other cities to help with his printing and distribution. So he was a wealthy publisher, reinvested in 89 rental properties. And so he organized a militia of non-Quakers and not members of the Penn family to defend eastern Pennsylvania, and he literally built forts on the Delaware River, organized a militia with his son, who had fought in King George's War and was a trained British officer, and they went basically from town to town, protecting the settlers. Benjamin Franklin got it right. He said people came and they wanted so much land, they were wide open. They were too far scattered for defense. Franklin came up with a brilliant idea. He designed a fort himself, and he wanted one every 10 miles, so nobody would be more than 5 miles from a fort. He managed to set up a defensive network, and he recruited 12,000 men. He wasn't supposed to have them. So the English were horrified. Tribune of the people, Robert Penn called him. But Franklin was always making $1. So he sold the booklets and the manual of arms for the men. He sold the German-made rifles. He sold the uniforms that the men wore, and he finagled and borrowed cannon. And he had the largest military force in North America for a short time.
Wow. So question here from my friend Brooks Lyles, who's the chair of the Education Committee of the Sons of the American Revolution. What did you learn about William Franklin that you didn't know before, and what influence did the Penn family proprietary leadership of Pennsylvania have on William Franklin, as the royal governor of New Jersey, and his choice to cast his lot with the crown rather than his father and the separatists?
Well, it's the young man looking at the older man as past it. I mean, to put it very succinctly, when Benjamin Franklin wound up in opposition to the crown and being fired as deputy postmaster general ignominiously in London, the son was appalled because he had become a royal governor. He treasured the fact that the King of England had put the royal touch on him to make him a governor of a colony. That was the greatest thing that American could aspire to at the time. His father not only had nothing to do with him getting the appointment, but he was horrified by it. When William Franklin came to New Jersey to take over as royal governor, that's where the break came. And when they were close, they were at each other's throats. When they were at a distance, they wrote wonderful letters and plotted huge real estate deals, etc. The father thought the son was making a horrible mistake and offered him a low-paying job in the post office. And the son said, "Are you kidding me? You're going to burn the colonies down." And he wanted no part of it. So what I learned was how personal this was within families. In my own family, there were loyalists and there were revolutionaries, and that was true of many. In the Adams family, in many families, there were people who were torn apart.
So going back a little bit, even before the end of the French and Indian War, the British imposed the Navigation Acts. And how did that measure affect Americans who invested in foreign trade and increase colonial black market?
Well, it's really important. It was 100 years before the Revolution. It was something that came up in the 1660s when England was really taking on the Dutch, who had a wonderful trading network, great ships, etc. So the the Parliament passed the Navigation Acts, which said that the English and Englishmen everywhere could only engage in trade in English ships with English crews. Well, that was a bit naive. As soon as a lot of Englishmen got to America, they didn't pay attention to that. And it wasn't until the British began trying to enforce it in the 1760s that the trouble came. You know, it's really striking to me that one day you're a successful merchant, and the next day Parliament can take a vote, and now you're a smuggler. And we have characterized our founding fathers as smugglers. No, they weren't. They were legitimate businessmen who wanted the freedom to engage in international trade, not be forced to sell their goods, their crops, the materials to the English, and then forced to buy the finished goods back. So the Americans were already free. It's when the British began to tighten the controls, and try to, in fairness to the English, they wound up in modern dollars with a $10 trillion debt after the 7 Years' War, after the French and Indian War. And they thought the Americans should pay for part of it, to which Benjamin Franklin basically said, piffle, you're making a lot of money because you have a monopoly on our trade. So the more the British cracked down, the more the resistance was. And so much of the story that's been left out, this was a merchants' war in many ways. And this was a war about trade and trade restrictions.
So with the clamping down on now expansion and the smuggling or the unenforceable navigation acts, Parliament starts to pass the steady stream of measures to try and bolster the crown coffers since they're so depleted. And these acts lead to the rallying cry that every American school child is taught, no taxation without representation. What percentage of the American population was taxed? I mean, and in other words, how were these measures affecting the common farmer or laborer or fisherman or sailor versus the landowners, the lawyers, the other gentry? I mean, how does it work between the upper classes, if you will, and the lower classes?
Well, if the British had succeeded in enforcing the taxes that they passed, everyone would have been affected, and in large ways and small. I say everyone because Americans had learned that they could trade in the Caribbean with the colonists of the other European empires, and they could buy coffee from the Dutch for a fraction of what they had to pay the English, shipping it all the way from India. So on that scale, Americans were so restricted, and I get into this mostly with George Washington. I mean, he has a fantastic farm, but he has to buy the hose to till the soil. He has to buy the plows. He has to buy the nails. He has to buy everything from the British. He has to buy glass for his windows, shiploads of glass. I mean, what a picture that is. When I see a truckload of glass, I drop back a little bit. But the idea of ships loaded with glass, Americans stopped putting glass in their windows. I mean, it affected every facet of life. You couldn't make a hat. It was illegal to make a hat. These laws accrued over time until George Washington got up one day and calculated how much he lost from his tobacco crops by having to ship them to England. And he figured it out. It was 75% of his profits for shipping, for hauling, for the ship, for warehousing, for the commissions that brokers who acted as their bankers soaked them for everything. And then they were sending back shoddy goods. Washington waited for years to save up. He literally saved up to buy a nice carriage. And when it arrived, the doors fell off and the thing was full of mold. Martha's dresses never fit, whatever she ordered. George Washington's wedding suit came 6 months late. I mean, how does it affect you? It affected Americans in every way as it got worse and worse, and as they worked harder and they prospered or tried to prosper. So
in the recently published, quite controversial 1619 project, it points to that it posits that the linchpin of the founding was the protection of the institution of slavery. You outline a number of the founders who enslaved people, but in Founders' Fortune, there seem to be so many other business interests in which our founders were engaged. Given your analysis and narrative, what conclusions might you offer as the justification for breaking from Great Britain?
I love documents, and people don't read them carefully. The Declaration of Independence, we don't really get past the opening. It's so beautifully written. It's so rhetorical. But get down to the grievances that Jefferson outlined, and that tells you what Americans were protesting. The very first one is, we are allowed no currency, we have no banks. No banks? There was no bank in the United States before the United States created its own bank at the Constitutional Convention. There were private bankers, but all money transactions had to go through London. And different colonies had paper and bank notes. But for example, James Madison, when he went to Congress for the first time in Philadelphia, and he was the son of a wealthy planter, they kicked his horse out of the stable while he's sitting in Congress because they wouldn't accept Virginia currency in Philadelphia. I mean, so the first thing in the Declaration of Independence, the first grievance is, we're not allowed to have banks, currency, our own money. People who write documents tend to be hierarchical. If you look at the Bill of Rights, or if you look at Magna Carta, it's easy to say that the first thing you read is the thing that was most on their minds. So the fact that they were not allowed economic freedom, that affected everybody. Sam Adams wound up loathing the British for very personal reasons. His father, who was the man with the successful malt business, he didn't make the beer, he made the stuff that made the beer. But Sam Adams' father set up a land bank in Massachusetts, giving mortgages to people who owned land as collateral. The British said, break it up. You can't have it, dissolve it. And Mr. Adams, you will return every penny yourself. So all of a sudden, Sam Adams, who's at Harvard, his father says, I can't afford to keep you there. And Sam Adams stayed, but he wound up waiting on table to go all the way through. And he wound up, I think, with a lifelong hatred for the British and the rulers.
So wars are expensive. How did we pay for our war? Tell us about Robert Morris and what his contribution to the effort was.
I'm so glad to get to Robert Morris. English-born, son of a tobacco trader, broker. When he was 15, he joined a counting house in Philadelphia, learned the business very quickly, and he had the idea of international trade. And he had partners set up in the Caribbean, in Europe, commercial partners, etc. So when the revolution came, he had ships. He had the best ship, the fastest ship. He gave it to George Washington as the nucleus of Washington's Navy. But he also had the idea of using Congress revenues from taxes, which they were collecting in the colonies, to set up a committee on trade and set up agents, especially in the Caribbean, so that American crops could become a currency commodity. And I had wondered, why did the French lend us money? I'd been told that's what the French Revolution is, because they gave too much money to the Americans. Well, that's not true. Actually, the king really personally wanted to help the Americans and gave the first million French pounds to help out. But from then on, it was loans. And how did the Americans expect to pay the loans? The very first thing they did after Lexington and Concord was open their ports to foreign trade, which violated the Navigation Acts of England. And what Robert Morris realized was that the French wanted the monopoly on American tobacco because they did not have any colonies that grew tobacco. Now, why was it so important to them? Here was one of the little surprises in the book. Europeans were hooked on snuff. We don't even hear about it anymore. There's a little part of your hand is called the bones are called the snuff box, where people would put a pinch of snuff and put it up, snort it, and sneeze at you. I mean, it sounds really gross, but that's what wealthy Europeans wanted. Poor people had to smoke pipe. But it was the French had to buy it from the English. I mean, that was so humiliating that Marie Antoinette had to get her snuff from England. But then Queen Charlotte had a whole room in Windsor Castle full of a variety of snuff. Everybody with any money was on snuff. Where am I going with this? The tobacco monopoly went to France at the end of the war. And France had all the snuff it wanted and never had to give a sou to the British for it.
So let's stick with the French a little bit here. So obviously the Americans were really in a need for the weapons. They had to try and figure out how to make their own gunpowder. They had to get artillery. How did the American leaders, founders at the time, was there war profiteering with the French or with the Dutch, or?
It was not war profiteering. That's one of the nice surprises. Franklin knew about the cost of making a gun because he had them made. He was selling them in a store in Philadelphia. And he knew that the French could make a good musket for half of what a Pennsylvanian could. Because the French were skilled and had massive munitions plants. And King Louis XVI wanted to help the Americans. So he sort of marked down weapons. He said, all our weapons need to be replaced. They're obsolete. Let the Americans have them. We'll give them a bargain price. And he set up courtiers who arranged that with Franklin. And with a figure we don't hear anything about, Silas Deane, a fabulous character that I urge you to read about. I wrote about the arms trade in the current issue, the winter issue of Military History Quarterly. It wasn't profiteering. It was learning how to get the Europeans to help secretly without risking war with the British. So Dutch gunpowder factories were working night and day. They were shipping the powder to the Dutch port of St. Eustatius in the Caribbean, where American ships were picking it up and bringing it up the coast. Also, they were charging the Americans 6 times the going rate for gunpowder in Europe. The profiteering was on the European end. But we were able to use something like what we would call trade credits today, to be able to send crops to Europe or future crops to Europe in exchange for weapons. So we didn't know how to make sulfur. Abigail Adams told her lady friends, what you do is you dig down underneath the privy, and that gives you the start of the sulfur that you need for to make gunpowder. But mostly it was smuggling, if you want to call it that, through the Caribbean, right under the nose of the English, and French guns, and more French guns. And I think the hinge of the Revolutionary War, many will agree, was the Battle of Saratoga. And Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne and his jolly friends had the surprise of their lives when they crossed over and faced French artillery, because the trade deals of Franklin and Morris had procured shiploads of cannon, muskets, bayonets, fabric to make uniforms, everything. And a convoy arrived off Massachusetts in time to get everything across the mountains in time to defeat Burgoyne. That's the upshot of all this trade and cooperation that the French were in. Now, I'm not saying that the whole thing was about a pinch of snuff, but Americans thought it was all about tea, so it's not too much of a stretch. But it was about old rival empires, basically, and the French had just been badly bloodied in the French and Indian War. So there's the element of revenge. Lafayette's father had been killed in battle, for example. So there's revenge, but don't forget the economic motivation. And did Americans get rich on it? Well, that's a lot of the book, did they? Well, Americans who were rich did an awful lot to help to make it work. But when it was all over, as many of them tanked financially as profited at any point from it.
So I noticed in your bibliography, one of the books that you read was Joel Paul's Unlikely Allies. It's something that you're going to have to let the folks at Dutton know, that they put an extra O in the end of Joel Paul's name in the bibliography there.
I'll catch it in the next edition, is what
Exactly.
authors usually say.
Well, full disclosure, Joel is a good friend, and in fact, he's one of my clients. So I happen to know him very well, and of course, when I started to read your telling the story of Beaumarchais and how Louis came to work with Dean. We all know about, it was Benjamin Franklin who brought the French into the war. And of course he had a lot to do with it, but the whole story about Silas Deane and Lee and is absolutely fascinating. And his book Unlikely Allies is a really almost a romp of a read. It's really quite.
Please ask him to send me an email on my website, and I will get the correction made.
Just listen, I'm a publisher. These things happen all the time.
I know, and they're usually blamed on the author.
The poor copy editors miss these little things. All right, so prior to the revolution, Parliament was looking to collect from its colonists a fraction of what the Britons were paying in taxes. So we win our independence. How'd that work out for us initially?
Usually there's a post-war economic collapse again and again. I mean, it's after World War I, you have a collapse that spreads all through the Depression. After the Revolution, nobody had any money. George Washington, when he wanted to give money to Princeton to sort of rebuild after his young aide Hamilton shelled Nassau Hall, Washington was in the audience of the first graduation from Princeton after the war, and he wanted to give 50 guineas, which is more than 50 pounds. And you multiply that by about a factor of 160 today to find out how many dollars that was. But all he had was gold with the image of George III on it. They still didn't have any money, literally did not have any money. Washington himself had lots of land, and he was switching away from slave labor to tenant farmers, which sometimes is a fine distinction. If you're a tenant farmer, it's a kind of slavery. But he was trying to rent land, and he lent some to his own veterans in Western Pennsylvania, and gave them money to set up a grist mill. But they couldn't even pay him back, and he got so mad about it that he actually took these people to court and had them evicted. But George Washington could not sell or rent his land. And that's just an example. It was a real depression, and it led in Massachusetts to Shays' Rebellion pretty quickly, because the government of Massachusetts got into the hands of merchants and businessmen who tried to shift the tax burden to property owners, which meant veterans with no cash were being hauled into sheriff's courts and foreclosed. I mean, it was touch and go for several years whether you'd have another revolution. And Washington was worried about that. And it's one of the reasons that he was behind having a federal government and take it away from individual states who could do the kind of thing that Massachusetts was doing.
So taking a step backwards here a little bit, just in time, another question from Brooks. America was a barter economy. Wages and debts were paid in goods, not specie. Parliament required taxes and debts to be paid in gold and silver, hard currency, not in goods. Did Parliament really intend to gut the colonial economy of North America and make them solely dependent on England? And did they expect America to roll over and just accept that?
Those are wonderful questions. Whatever Parliament expected from the very first, from the Stamp Act, they ran into far more resistance than they ever imagined or that could have happened in England. The Stamp Act, by the way, is an example of how it hit everybody. George Washington liked to play cards and roll dice at his little gaming table in Mount Vernon with his friends. But to open a pack of cards cost him 10 shillings to buy the tax on those cards. He could buy 2 horses for the tax on a deck of cards, just to put the thing into perspective. The British also had romanticized how wealthy Americans were because they saw some Americans, as in the South or in Boston, riding around in carriages with people in livery and all of that. And they generalized from that and went back to England, where they were paying terrible taxes for the war. And the English people were furious at the Americans. On key votes of Parliament before the Revolution, it was 4 for parliamentary measures to every one of the Americans. So the English people felt that we were taking advantage and supported Parliament. And the Americans said, you gave us charters to set up our own governments. You do not have the right to tax us. Taxation without representation is tyranny. I mean, the wonder is it didn't explode sooner.
So let's talk about the other Americans, the Loyalists. We've talked about our founders and Washington and Franklin, and I'll have a question about Henry Knox in a minute, but tell us about the Loyalists. And I mean, they didn't pledge their sacred honor. Tell us what happened to the Loyalists.
Well, they thought they were upholding their sacred honor, for one thing. And by the way, how many were there? You don't get a picture very easily, or at least I didn't when I was beginning to study this. But there's a wonderful correspondence I'm sure you're all familiar with between Jefferson and Adams when they're old and they're not at each other's throats politically. And as John Adams had said, 1/3 of Americans wanted independence. I'm paraphrasing. 1/3 wanted to remain loyal to their king, and the other third depended on where the armies were. Well, if that's true, that means there were as many loyal as there were hot-blooded for independence. My own estimate from doing a lot of work on this is about 26% of Americans were loyalists. What happened to them? Well, if they didn't leave, as thousands did, for Canada or the Caribbean or England, they had no civil rights. The states did not honor the Treaty of Paris and extend civil rights, legal rights to the Loyalists. The Loyalists could not collect debts. If they tried to, they were persecuted. The only founding father who really dealt fairly with the Loyalists was Hamilton, but then they were paying him for it. He set up his law practice and he represented a lot of the Loyalists who had business interests in New York. But the Loyalists got the short end of the stick in many ways, except, and be fair to the English when you're writing American history, because Parliament did something it's never done before or since. The House of Lords gave 1 year's budget for war to distribute among the Loyalists. And there were claims commissions set up if they could document their losses. But mostly the Loyalists left or buried their heads. And the loss was terrible. Most of the graduating class of Yale of 1758 was Loyalist, for example, lawyers, bankers, government officials. And there were a lot of the Loyalists had just arrived a few years ago from England. They had no beef with the king. They just wanted a little piece of land that they could pass on to their kids. A lot of them actually walked to Canada. So you got Ontario, what we call Ontario province. You got New Brunswick. You got Nova Scotia, where many, many black and white loyalists froze in the snow in the years right after the Revolution.
So you mentioned Hamilton a couple of times. Now would be an appropriate time to ask the question from another one of our regular audience members. Mike Barbieri asks, how long did it take the United States to pay off the debt, the war debt?
They didn't. That's what the Constitutional Convention was all about, basically. And basically, the war debts were subsumed into the national government. So the famous, what they call the dinner table bargain, where Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison get together and do a little trade. Hamilton wanted the federal government to pay off the individual states' war debts by issuing bonds on the new United States government and banks. And then those could be used as collateral for loans or build up the revenues of a national bank. Jefferson wouldn't buy into that. Jefferson was worse than terrible with money. He was a compulsive shopper, and to have him representing the South, a notorious debtor, it took him 54 years to finish his house because he could never get the money together all at once. And what Jefferson wanted was not to have the government in the North, not to have it in Philadelphia, which is what was in the Articles of Confederation, and not certainly to have it in New York with Hamilton. So they wound up, the South in Congress signed on with Hamilton to the funding of those debts, rolling them together in exchange for putting the capital of the United States in Washington, D.C. That was the bargain. But Hamilton was brilliant. He was why wasn't Robert Morris Secretary of the Treasury? He knew so much more about money. Robert Morris is fascinating. He actually paid Washington's troops in notes that he signed himself, everything he had, all his assets. He cut up pieces of paper and signed 6,000 pieces of paper with his own hand so Washington could pay the troops so they could go home with dignity and not think of mutiny. So why wasn't he the one for Secretary of the Treasury? Because he had the humility to say, young Hamilton knows more about it than anybody. And that's how you got Alexander Hamilton, he was an economist. Hamilton flunked math his first year at what we call Columbia. So he couldn't go on and become a doctor. But he wound up being the Secretary of the Treasury. But he studied the French economy, he studied the English economy, and he's the one that came up with our financial plan. But he never took the money for himself. He was so broke when Burr shot him that they had to pass the hat. They had to take a collection for Alexander Hamilton's funeral.
So you mentioned Robert Morris again. One of the you heard me talk about the tours that I give in the Trenton, Princeton area. I live right off of something called the Federal City Road. And I explain to people when I'm giving these tours, when we pass by Federal City Road, that Robert Morris was one of the investors who was trying to convince Congress that the capital of the country should be Trenton.
Right.
So you had people who wanted Princeton to be the capital, people who wanted Trenton to be the capital. Every town and city along the eastern seaboard wanted to be capital. So going back to your chapter where you talk about the deal that was made, is always humorous to me because I think at the time that all of the money that Robert Morris had lost in speculating in all the land probably that I live on, because he was thinking that Trenton was going to be the capital of the nation.
It wasn't a wild idea because Philadelphia again and again had been where the Congress was, and it was central in a way. If you looked at population, and in the Articles of Confederation, which they finally passed after 5 years, it said that there would be a new permanent capital in the Delaware River, what we call a valley. There's no valley, but in the Delaware Valley. And so people were investing in that idea. It's only that very good bottle of French wine over dinner with Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison that they pulled the rug out from under Hamilton and the North. But Hamilton could not get his assumption of debt bill through Congress without the support of the South. And again, it's this compromise between the North and the South. We look at the differences because we look back from the Civil War. And that's a shame if we only look at the Civil War and how that century ended. But if we look back before that, it's one compromise after another. And that's new in the history of politics, compromise.
So we only have time for one more question. The founder's fortunes goes beyond the revolution, and you do a terrific job in outlining how our nation got on its financial feet. If you were to summarize that period between 1784 and 1800, what is your reader going to learn about our early republic that is relevant today?
Everything. Our two parties always at each other's throats, and within them factions, so that it can come down to one vote of the Senate of the United States again and again. And that one vote having more power effectively than the president of the United States on some days. That was going on. Washington hated it. He hated partisanship. He only stayed the second term to keep Hamilton and Jefferson away from each other's throats. And they went off and they formed political parties, which he was really opposed to. And the story of the years after Washington's presidency are, in a way, the Second American Revolution that stopped short of shots. But the Second Revolution is the election of 1800, where it came down to horse trading, who was going to vote, who was not going to vote in Congress. So the birth of our politics is in that period. It's the birth of our institutions, but it's also the birth of the difficulties of maintaining a democracy.
Well, I've put the URL to your website in the chat. It's willardrandall.net. And I encourage everybody to visit Willard's website to learn more about his work. If you have questions for him directly, or if you would like to invite him to come talk to your roundtable or your SAR chapter or your historic site, you should get in touch with Willard. As you can see, he's terrific at what he does. And Willard, I want to thank you for your time. You have been terrific. I have learned so much, not only from reading your book, but even though I've read your book, I learned some more tonight. So I thank you for that. I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening at historyauthortalks.com. I will have this program, the video of this program on historyauthortalks.com, the past shows tab, by tomorrow evening. So I invite you to send that to everybody. We have more shows always coming up. So go to historyauthortalks.com. And if you're looking to help my efforts with my partners. You can always go to 10crucialdays.org and donate to our nonprofit organization. And with that, I wanted to say thank you to everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Take
Thank you.
care. Bye now.